Good morning, my friends. So we are going to be picking up where we left off at chapter 5. When we last left Stanley, he was kind of observing his surroundings, having first arrived at Camp Green Lake, and Mr. Sir kind of makes a comment to him right at the end of chapter 4 saying, "You thirsty?" asks Mr. Sir, and Stanley says, "Yes, Mr. Sir." And he says, "Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be thirsty for the next 18 months. So, kind of setting up the scene here for how things are going to go with Stanley here at Camp Green Lake. So let's jump into chapter 5. Okay, I'm reading it on my iPad for right now since my copy of the book is at school, and I'm hopeful to get a copy of it this week when I go to pack up our stuff. Okay, so chapter 5. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had black letters on it, A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendenski was his counselor. "My name is easy to remember," said Mr. Pendenski, as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. "3 easy words: pen, dance, and key." Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendenski was younger than Mr. Sir, and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald. His face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. "Mr. Sir isn't really so bad," said Mr. Pendenski. "He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake: don't upset the warden." Stanley nodded as if he understood. "I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you," Mr. Pendenski said. "I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid." Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendenski to think he had a bad attitude. "I'm going to help you turn your life around," said his counselor, "but you're going to have to help too. I can count on your help?" "Yes, sir," said Stanley. Mr. Pendenski said, "Good," and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendenski called to them, "Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team." The boys glanced warily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that the one kid was white and the other was black. "What happened to Barf Bag?" asked the black kid. "Lewis is still in the hospital," said Mr. Pendenski. "He won't be returning." He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves like gentlemen. "Hi," the white kid grunted. "That's Alan," said Mr. Pendenski. "My name's not Alan," the boy said. "It's Squid, and that's X-Ray." "Hey," said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendenski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led him inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the one next to it. "Which was Lewis's cot?" Mr. Pendenski asked. "Barf Bag slept here," said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. "All right, Stanley, that'll be yours," said Mr. Pendenski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barf Bag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barf Bag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendenski: Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. "They all have nicknames," explained Mr. Pendenski. "However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hard-working members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendenski. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendenski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name is Zero? Asked Mr. Pendenski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pendenski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, then go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit in a thin line of saliva through between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendenski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendenski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him, do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, they made him feel a little bit better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by someone named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. All right, so we've met some interesting characters here. Okay, I don't know about you, but would you want to be called Armpit? I can't say that I would. All right, let's go on to chapter 6. Stanley took a shower, if you could call it that, ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call his smelly and scratchy cot a bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper was only allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold water. There was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into it, and then jumping back from the spray until the water shut off automatically. He never managed to use his bar soap, which was just as well, because he wouldn't have had time to rinse off the suds. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown, and the vegetables had once been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all, and used his slice of ripe bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on his plate, no matter how it tasted. What'd you do? One of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. They sent you here for a reason. Oh, he realized, I stole a pair of sneakers. The other boys thought it was funny. Stanley wasn't sure why. Maybe because their crimes were a lot worse than stealing shoes. From a store, or were they on someone's feet? Asked Squid. Neither, Stanley answered. They belonged to Clyde Livingston. Nobody believed him. Sweet feet, said X-Ray. Yeah, right. No way, said Squid. Now as Stanley lay on his cot, it was kind of funny in a way. Nobody had believed him when he said he was innocent. Now, when he said he stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweet Feet Livingston was a famous baseball player. He'd led the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was also the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. He used to have the poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now. It had been taken by the police and used as evidence of his guilt in the courtroom. Clyde Livingston also came to court In spite of everything, when Stanley found out that Sweet Feet was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers and that he had donated them to help raise money for the homeless shelter. He said he couldn't imagine what kind of horrible person would steal from homeless children. That was the worst part for Stanley. His hero thought he was a no-good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn over on his cot, he was afraid it was going to collapse under all his weight. He barely fit in it. When he finally managed to roll over on his stomach, the smell was so bad that he had to turn over again and try sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like sour milk. Ugh. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring 2 cots away. Back at school, a bully named Derek Doone used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaints seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even seemed to find it amusing that a little kid like Derek could pick on someone as big as Stanley. On the day Stanley was arrested, Derek had taken Stanley's notebook, and after a long game of come and get it, finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' restroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he had missed the bus. He'd missed his bus and had to walk home. It was while he was walking home, carrying his wet notebook, with the prospect of having to copy the ruined pages, that the sneakers fell from the sky. "I was walking home and the sneakers fell from the sky," he had told the judge. "One hit me on the head. It had hurt, too." They hadn't exactly fallen from the sky. He had just walked out from under a freeway overpass when the shoe hit him on the head. Stanley took it as some kind of sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers. And suddenly, a pair of sneakers fell on top of him, seemingly out of nowhere, like a gift from God. Naturally, he had no way of knowing they belonged to Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had a bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think that they were something special about the shoes, that they could somehow provide the key to his father's invention. It was too much of a coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley had felt like he was holding Destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure why he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father, or maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable, humiliating day at school. A patrol car pulled alongside him. A policeman asked him why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on his radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. It turned out the sneakers had been stolen from a display at the homeless shelter. That evening, rich people were going to come to the shelter and pay hundreds of dollars to eat the food that the poor people ate every day for free. Clyde Livingston, who had once lived at the shelter when he was younger, was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned, and it was expected that they would sell for over $5,000. All the money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed several months. His parents couldn't afford a lawyer. "You don't need a lawyer," his mother said. "Just tell the truth." Stanley told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he had lied a little. He could have said he found the shoes in the street. No one believed they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime despicable. The shoes were valued at over $5,000. It was money that would provide food and shelter for the homeless, and you stole that from them just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said that there was an opening at Camp Green Lake, and he suggested that the discipline of the camp might improve Stanley's character. It was either that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have some time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a quick decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. The shovel felt heavy in Stanley's hand. Sorry, this is going on chapter 7 now. So the shovel felt heavy in Stanley's soft, fleshy hands. He tried to jam it into the earth, but the blade banged against the ground and bounced off without making a dent. The vibrations ran up the shaft of the shovel and into Stanley's wrists, making his bones rattle. It was still dark. The only light came from the moon and the stars, more stars than Stanley had ever seen before. It seemed he had only just gotten to sleep when Mr. Pendanski came in and woke everyone up. Using all his might, he brought that shovel back down onto the dry lake bed. The force stung his hands, but made no impression on the earth. He wondered if he had a defective shovel. He glanced at Zero, about 15 feet away, who had scooped out a shovelful of dirt and dumped it onto a pile that was already almost a foot tall. For breakfast, they'd been served some kind of lukewarm cereal. The best part was the orange juice. They each got a pint carton. The cereal actually didn't taste too bad, but it smelled like his cot. They then filled their canteen, got their shovels, and were marched out across the lake. Each group was assigned a different area. The shovels were kept in a shed near the showers. They all looked the same to Stanley, although X-Ray had his own special shovel, which no one else was allowed to use. X-Ray claimed it was shorter than all the others, but if it was only by a fraction of an inch. The shovels were 5 feet long, from the tip of the steel blade to the end of the wooden shaft. Stanley's hole would have to be as deep as his shovel, and he'd have to be able to lay the shovel flat across the bottom in any direction. That was why X-Ray wanted the shortest shovel. The lake was so full of holes and mounds that it reminded Stanley of pictures he'd seen of the moon. If you find anything interesting or unusual, Mr. Pendanski had told him, you should report it to me or Mr. Sir when we come round with the water truck. If the warden likes what you found, you'll get the rest of the day off. What are we supposed to be looking for? Stanley asked him. You're not looking for anything. You're digging to build character. It's just if you find anything, the warden would like to know about it. He glanced helplessly at his shovel. It wasn't defective. He was defective. He noticed a thin crack in the ground. He placed the point of his shovel on top of it. Then he jumped on the back of the blade with both feet. The shovel sank a few inches into the packed earth. He smiled. For once in his life, it paid to be overweight. He leaned on the shaft and pried up his first shovelful of dirt, then dumped it off to the side. Only 10 million more to go, he thought. Then he placed the shovel back in the crack and jumped on it again. He unearthed several shovelfuls of dirt in his manner before it occurred to him that he was dumping his dirt within the perimeter of his hole. He laid his shovel flat on the ground and marked where the edges of the hole would be. 5 feet was awfully wide. He moved the dirt he'd already dug out past his mark. He took a drink from his canteen. 5 feet would be awfully deep, too. The digging got easier after a while. The ground was hardest at the surface, where the sun had baked a crust about 8 inches deep. Beneath that, the earth was looser. By the time Stanley broke past the crust, a blister had formed in the middle of his right thumb, and it hurt to hold the shovel. Stanley's great-great-grandfather was named Ilya Yelnats. He lived in Latva. When he was 15 years old, he fell in love with Myra Menke. He didn't know he was Stanley's great-great-grandfather. Myra Menke was 14. She would turn 15 in 2 months, at which time her father decided she should be married. Ilya went to her father to ask for her hand, but so did Igor Barkov, the pig farmer. Igor was 57 years old. He had a red nose and fat, puffy cheeks. I will trade you my fattest pig for your daughter, Igor offered. And what have you got? Myra's father asked Ilya. A heart full of love, said Ilya. I'd rather have a fat pig, said Myra's father. Desperate, Ilya went to see Madame Zeroni. an old Egyptian woman who lived on the edge of town. He had become friends with her, though she was quite a bit older than him. She was even older than Igor Barkov. The other boys in his village liked to mud wrestle. Ilya preferred visiting Madame Zeroni and listening to her many stories. Madame Zeroni had dark skin and a very wide mouth. When she looked at you, her eyes seemed to expand, and you felt like she was looking right through you. "Ilya, what's wrong?" she asked, before he even told her he was upset. She was sitting in a homemade wheelchair. She had no left foot. Her leg stopped at her ankle. "I'm in love with Myra Menke," Ilya confessed, "but Igor Barkov has offered to trade his fattest pig for her. I cannot compete with that." "Good," said Madame Zeroni. "You're too young to get married. You've got your whole life ahead of you." "But I love Myra. Myra's head isn't as empty as a flower pot." "But she's beautiful." "So is a flower pot. Can she push a plow? Can she milk a goat? No, she is too delicate. Can she have an intelligent conversation? No, she is silly and foolish. Will she take care of you when you are sick? No. She is spoiled and will only want you to take care of her. So, she is beautiful. So what?" Madame Zeroni spat on the dirt. She told Ilya he should go to America. "Like my son, there is where your future lies, not with Myra Menke." But Ilya would not hear none of that. He was 15, and all he could see was Myra's shallow beauty. Madame Zeroni hated to see Ilya so forlorn. Against her better judgment, she agreed to help him. "It just so happens my sow gave birth to a litter of piglets yesterday," she said. "There is a little runt whom she won't suckle. You may have him. He would die anyway." Madame Zeroni led Ilya around the back of her house where she kept her pigs. Ilya took the tiny piglet, but he didn't see what good it would do him. It wasn't much bigger than a rat. "Here you go, girl," Madame Zeroni assured him. "Do you see the mountain and the edge of the forest?" "Yes," said Ilya. "On the top of that mountain there is a stream where the water runs uphill. You must carry the piglet every day to the top of the mountain and let it drink from the stream. As it drinks, you are to sing to him." She taught Ilya a special song to sing to the pig. On the day of Myra's 15th birthday, you should carry the pig up the mountain for the last time. Then take it directly to Myra's father. It will be fatter than any of Igor's pigs. "If it is that big and fat," asked Ilya, "how will I be able to carry it up the mountain?" "The piglet is not too heavy for you now, is it?" asked Madame Zeroni. "Well, of course not," said Ilya. "Do you think it will be too heavy for you tomorrow?" "No." "Every day you will carry the pig up the mountain. It will get a little bigger, but you will also get a little stronger. After you give the pig to Myra's father, I want you to do one more thing for me." "Anything," said Ilya. "I want you to carry me up the mountain. I want to drink from the stream. I want you to sing the song to me." Ilya promised he would. Madame Zeroni warned that if he failed to do this, he and all his descendants would be doomed for all eternity. At that time, Ilya thought nothing of the curse. He was just a 15-year-old kid, and eternity didn't seem much longer than a week from Tuesday. Besides, he liked Madame Zeroni, and he'd be glad to carry her up the mountain. He would have done it right then and there, but he wasn't strong enough yet. Stanley was digging. His hole was about 3 feet deep, but only in the center. It sloped upward to the edges. The sun had only just come up over the horizon, but he could already feel its hot rays against his face. As he reached down to pick up his canteen, he felt a sudden rush of dizziness and put his hands on his knees to steady himself. For a moment, he was afraid he would throw up, but the moment passed. He drank the last drop of water from his canteen. He had blisters on every one of his fingers and one of them in the center of each palm. Everyone else's hole was a lot deeper than his. He couldn't actually see their holes, but he could tell by the size of their dirt piles. He was a cloud, a dust moving across the wasteland, and he saw a cloud of dust moving across the wasteland and noticed the other boys had stopped digging and were watching it too. The dirt cloud moved closer, and he could see that it trailed by a red pickup truck. The truck stopped near where they were digging, and the boys lined up behind it. X-Ray in front, Zero in the rear. Stanley got in line behind Zero. Mr. Sir filled each of their canteens from the tank of water in the bed of his pickup. As he took Stanley's canteen from him, he said, "This isn't Girl Scouts, is it?" Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. Mr. Sir followed Stanley back to his hole to see how he was doing. "You better get with it," he said, "or else you're going to be digging in the hottest part of the day." He popped some sunflower seeds into his mouth, deftly removed the shells with his teeth, and spat them into Stanley's hole. Every day, Elia carried the little piglet up the mountain and sang to it as it drank from the stream. As the pig grew fatter, Elia grew stronger. On the day of Myra's 15th birthday, Elia's pig weighed over 50 stones. Madame Zeroni had told him to carry the pig up the mountain on that day as well, but Elia didn't want to present himself to Myra smelling like a pig. Instead, he took a bath, and it was his second bath in less than a week. Then he led the pig to Myra's. Igor Barkov was there with his pig as well. "These are two of the finest pigs I've ever seen," Myra's father declared. He was also impressed with Ilya, who seemed to have grown bigger and stronger in the last 2 months. "I used to think you were a good-for-nothing book reader," he said, "but now I see that you could be an excellent mud wrestler." "May I marry your daughter?" Ilya boldly asked. "First, I must weigh the pigs." Alas, poor Ilya should have carried his pig up the mountain one last time. The two pigs weighed exactly the same. Gosh, poor Ilya. Stanley's blisters had ripped open and new blisters formed. He kept changing his grip on the shovel to try and avoid the pain. Finally, he removed his cap and held it between the shaft of his shovel and his raw hands. This helped, but digging was harder because the cap would slip and slide. The sun beat down on his unprotected head and neck. Though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he'd been aware for a while that his piles of dirt were too close to his hole. The piles were outside his 5-foot circle, but he could see he was going to run out of room. Still, he pretended otherwise and kept adding more dirt to the piles that he would eventually have to move. The problem was that when the dirt was in the ground, it was compacted. It expanded when it was excavated. The piles were a lot bigger than his hole was deep. It was either now or later. Reluctantly, he climbed out of his hole and once again dug his shovel into his previously dug dirt. Myra's father got down on his hands and knees and closely examined each pig tail to snout. "Those are two of the finest pigs I have ever seen," he said at last. "How am I going to decide? I only have one daughter." "Why not let Myra decide?" suggested Ilya. "That's preposterous!" exclaimed Igor, expelling saliva as he spoke. "Myra is just an empty-headed girl," said her father. "How can she possibly decide when I, her father, can't?" "She knows how she feels in her heart," said Ilya. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, "Why not?" He slapped Ilya on the back. "It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig." He summoned his daughter. Ilya blushed when Myra entered the room. "Good afternoon, Myra," he said. She looked at him. "You're Ilya, right?" she asked. "Myra," said her father, "Ilya and Igor have each offered a pig for your hand in marriage. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. So I will let you make the choice. Whom do you wish to marry? Myra looked confused. You want me to decide? That's right, my blossom, said her father. Gee, I don't know, said Myra. Which pig weighs more? They both weigh the same, said her father. Golly, said Myra, I guess I'll choose Ilya. No, Igor. No, Ilya. No, Igor. Oh, I know. I think of a number between 1 and 10. I'll marry whoever guesses the closest number. Okay, I'm ready. 10, guessed Igor. Ilya said nothing. Ilya? Said Myra. What number do you guess? Ilya didn't pick a number. Marry Igor, he muttered. You can keep my pig as a wedding present. Wonder why he was so upset. The next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Pendinsky, who also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. How you doing? Asked Magnet. Not real good, said Stanley. Well, the first hole's the hardest, Magnet said. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others, and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet. He didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what they would do to him. What could they do to him? His clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It's nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom? Asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arm to the great expanse around them. Pick a hole, any hole, he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, but first make sure there's nothing living in it. After Myra's house, Ilya wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of a pier and stared down into the cold, black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even though she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on another dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deck hands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Ilya was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked enviously. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, then turned around and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big, round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck. It was like on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat in his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Ilya learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, think for herself. She and Ilya often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Ilya worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Ilya was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Madame Zeroni, or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Ilya wasn't sure what to do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him? After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm the worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone else who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Ilya. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "That's so pretty. What does it mean?" Ilya tried his best to translate it from Latvian into English, but it wasn't the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, their child was born. Sarah had named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backward. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf lights below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon. If only. Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt. Then raised it up and flung it onto a pile. He laid his shovel back down on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before he could lie flat across his hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride at being able to show Mr. Sir, or Mr. Pendensky, that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he just didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley!" he heard Mr. Pendensky call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the hole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Pendensky walking over to him. "I was afraid you fainted," Mr. Pendensky said. "You wouldn't have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap on his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendensky, raising his hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pendensky lowered his hand and looked at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Pendensky climbed into his truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away. Then he took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. Chapter 8. A lot of people don't believe in curses. A lot of people don't believe in yellow-spotted lizards either, but if one bites you, it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not. Actually, it's kind of odd that scientists named the lizard after its yellow spots. Each lizard has exactly 11 yellow spots, but the spots are hard to see on its yellow-green body. The lizard is from 6 to 10 inches long and has big red eyes. In truth, its eyes are yellow, and it is the skin around the eyes which is red. But everyone always speaks of its red eyes. It also has black teeth and a milky white tongue. Looking at one, you would have thought that it should have been named a red-eyed lizard, or a black-toothed lizard, or perhaps a white-tongued lizard. If you've ever been close enough to see the yellow spots, you are probably dead. The yellow-spotted lizards like to live in the holes, which offered shade from the sun and protection from predatory birds. Up to 20 lizards may live in one hole. They have strong, powerful legs and can leap out of a very deep hole to attack their prey. They eat small animals, insects, certain cactus thorns, and the shell of sunflower seeds. All right, my friends. So that is chapters 5 through 8. Okay. The next set of chapters I will be reading is chapters 9 through 12. So make sure to check that out tomorrow. And I will see you in Zoom. Bye, guys.